Bonjour, bonjour, mes amis. It is wonderful to be here with you this morning and continuing our exploration of the new genes that appear in the DNA 360. Tonight, we have the delight of going over some genes that mess with your mind and mess with the way you engage with the world. Tonight, we're going to be going over assessments and genes that really influence how you engage in relationship and, more importantly, how relationships engage with you. I wonder if you'll indulge me. Just close your eyes for a second, and I want you to think back to first grade. I want you to think back to that school time, and I want you to think back perhaps who you were at that time. There's many different characters and actors that we would see in that first grade classroom. There's obviously the class clown. There might be a popular kid or two. There's going to be the very awkward nerd that maybe didn't have a lot of friends. And then there's going to be the people that had a lot of friends and fun and tumbled and played. And, when we think back about those times, right, especially before the world really had a lot of time to influence who we are, this is one of the times we see genes coming so much into the picture and having such influence as to, again, how we engage with others and how that engagement impacts us. So tonight, one of the genes that shaped us as children, that shapes us today, that we are going to be exploring is OXTR. It's a gene that influences your oxytocin receptor. And to partake on this adventure, to jump into this magic school bus with me, oh my gosh, I wish I was Miss Frizzle, or I wish also she was Miss Frizzle. All things would be equally cool. Dr. Varden, welcome, Medell. How are you?
Hello, I'm doing quite well, thank you.
Good.
Yes, it's really just wonderful when we're talking about those social connections. How do we feel connection and conflict even?
Yeah.
And, that's that's what this information is really going to start to dive into. And I do want to say though that tonight, our goal is not to label anyone or diagnose anything. So instead, really, our goal is to help you understand your own tendencies a little bit better so you can recognize your patterns and have more choice in how you respond. So,
Yeah. Yeah, I like that. I like that the more we know about genes and how they can educate us as to how our body works or how our brain experiences and perceives the world, that can really, to an extent, be like, oh, okay, well, that's why I do that. And then gives us a space to be like, I either like that and I want to support it, or I don't, I want to change it a little bit. Right?
yeah, absolutely. For all of you out there, if you do have your DNA 360 reports, especially with the new genes, we will be drawing on the DNA
Mhm.
360 mood and behavior assessment. And that really looks at a cluster of genes involved in stress, mood, attention, social bonding, and addiction tendencies. And
Mm.
in the social bonding space, it focuses, yes, on the oxytocin receptor variants that Dr. Kosterman mentioned, plus a few supporting systems that we'll
Mhm.
call gain dials on the
Mhm.
social brain that Dr. Kosterman will speak a bit more into.
Yeah.
So,
I love that.
yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for setting the stage there because I think it would be wrong of us to present and it would be
Mhm.
not to correct belief if we were to say socialization comes down to one gene and one gene alone. It's a whole
Yeah,
collection plus all your history. Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah.
So, and by the way, everyone, if you have a question, please make sure to put it in the question answer box. If for some reason you do not want us saying your name with your question, when you are typing your question, just put either like anonymous or please don't say my name, before you ask the question, and we'll make sure to keep your question anonymous. But obviously, if you like us saying, hey, Krista's asking a question and you'd like us to say your name, well, then of course we will do so because we do
Yeah.
appreciate your questions.
Yeah. Yeah. Perfect. Dr. Varnon, would you like to run over some of our poll questions? Because before we get started, audience, we care about what you think.
Yes. Thank you for bringing that up. All right. So we asked, what why did you come here today? What sparked your
Mhm.
interest? And there's actually a pretty even answer between being curious how genetics influence connection and trust and just general curiosity. And I have to say, I love being curious.
Yeah.
That keeps your brain young, active, and really works into longevity. So I'm really glad that you all are so curious uh, in what we're doing. Our next question dove into asking, what are your tendencies in supportive relationships? And the majority of you said that you thrive and feel noticeably more confident. And yes, there are genes for that. So that's wonderful. We love to hear that because social connection, bonding, supportive relationships absolutely contribute to health, wellness, and longevity. For our third question, we asked, what are your tendencies when it comes to when a relationship feels tense or uncertain? And actually, rightfully so, the majority of you said, well, it depends on the person. Absolutely, it depends on the person because a relationship is about at least two people. So, how do they respond? How do they do? And then working that
Mhm.
together. But that was followed up by many of you saying that you feel it deeply and have trouble letting it go. And again, there are social networks that we're going to be talking about into why that might happen, into what you can do. Not saying it's good or bad. It's just that's the way it is. And how can you better navigate your relationships to make sure they are strong and robust and that you are in a healthy state? For our fourth question, we asked, comparing yourselves to others, what would you say you are? And very interestingly, is that more than half of you say that you're more emotionally sensitive.
Mm.
And that was followed up by less emotionally sensitive. I mean, it's a beautiful grouping here. And very interestingly, there were enough of you who said, about the same, and some that you're not sure. So hopefully, as we go through this, you can look back on ways that you interact in your relationships, how you feel in certain situations, whether it be with one or two people, whether it be in a crowd. But that can actually help to give you some insight on that. And our final question, we wanted for you to state what was most true for you. And we have the majority of you saying that the right people bring out the best or my best self. And isn't that the truth? And, that's why you may not be able to choose or you may not be able to choose your family.
Yeah.
Hopefully, your family, you've got a good, strong family, but you can certainly choose your friends and who you hang out with and your partner. So,
Yeah.
choose those right people.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
And I think Anne made a really wonderful comment in the chat. And Anne was saying this is really important information for clients and patients, right? In spaces of how do you develop a better relationship and how do you speak better to someone? And it reminds me once of a consult that I gave someone where this was during pandemic. And so, during pandemic, it was all over web and everyone was scooshed into small spaces. So you can kind of always hear what other people were saying on the computer. So I was explaining to this one person about a gene that made them a little bit more cold, socially speaking, and that was more just the way people perceived them, not necessarily the way they felt. And in the background, this person's partner chimed in, "That's why." And it became all of a sudden a consult for two because this gene and then this conversation really educated plainly this partner as to their response. And so I'm excited for the genes that we're talking about this evening because not only will they help you know yourself a bit better, interestingly, I think especially if you have family members or partners or other people in your world that have these genes, it can become a point where you work on relational improvement, right? Something
right.
that's so,
And
yeah.
and better understanding for those with whom you are living or spending time together, even coworkers. If you're spending time in an office and you're, trying to deal with someone, if you can understand and appreciate, oh, well, that's how they are, and just have a little softening toward that and a little more
Mhm.
forgiveness. So
Yeah. So let's dive in here, Dr. Varden, or Ms. Frizzle, as I might now call you, because yes, I love it. So, Dr. Varden, why don't we set the stage? So we know that eventually we're going to start talking about the new gene that is
right.
OXTR, which we
Mhm.
know is an oxytocin receptor. Why don't we
Yes.
start with, so what is oxytocin and why do we care about it? Um, I would imagine most people in the audience, if they've heard of oxytocin, they kind of think about it like a cuddle hormone, a hormone that bonds people. Is
Mhm.
that true, or should we be rethinking that definition?
Well, I mean, yes, it is relative to the cuddle hormone, but that's not all that it is. That nickname is actually too simple. In
Right.
real life, oxytocin is more like a spotlight the brain uses to pay attention to social information. It helps your brain notice faces, tone of voice, and the feeling of safety or threat in relationships. Depending on your wiring and your life experiences, that spotlight can make connection feel especially rich and soothing, or it can make conflict and rejection feel especially intense.
Mhm.
So, but I mean, when we're talking about oxytocin itself, oxytocin is a small signaling molecule. It's a peptide hormone made mainly in the part of the brain called the hypothalamus. It travels both in the bloodstream and directly inside the brain, and it does its work by binding to oxytocin receptors, which are the docking stations built by the OXTR genes. So these oxytocin receptors, they're not spread randomly, okay? They are concentrated in a few key regions that are deeply involved in relationships. So, first part of the brain, the amygdala. And this is a very interesting place in the brain. It's actually deep in the brain, central. And the name came from the Greek word almond, because it's more of the shape of an almond. And this is your brain's threat detector. Then it also, these oxytocin receptors are also in the nucleus accumbens and ventral striatum. And these are core parts of the reward system. They help determine what feels good and motivating. Then we have the hippocampus. I'm sure many people have heard of the hippocampus. And this is something that helps link emotional experiences to memory. Then we have that prefrontal cortex, that executive function, especially the area of the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. And this helps with meaning making, decision making, and that regulation. And you can really think of this as a social network in the brain. These oxytocin receptors sit at important junctions where threat, reward, memory, and regulation all talk to each other. They're having their own social, party going on. So when oxytocin binds to those receptors, it subtly, I'd say it subtly, okay, retunes that whole network. So, talking, and I know I get into my neuroscience background and my geekiness, but in simple language, oxytocin in the brain tends to do three main things. First thing, it can quiet the threat response when that situation is actually safe. So that means, like, in a genuinely safe relationship, oxytocin helps the amygdala calm down your body so it doesn't stay stuck in the fight or flight. The second thing it can do, it can turn up the brightness on social cues. So faces, recognition faces, eye contact, tone of voice, body language become more noticeable and more meaningful. Your brain pays more attention to that. What is that person feeling? Or, what's happening between us right now? So the third thing is that it supports approach, trust, and affiliation toward people your brain tags as safe, or like they're part of my group. Okay. It becomes a little bit easier to lean in, to share, to repair things after conflict, and also feel soothed by closeness when those receptors are engaged in that supportive context. So, something to think about is that a very helpful metaphor here is that the OXTR is kind of like a volume knob on your brain's social safety signal. So when that volume is turned up, and you're with someone who is safe, like many of you, it depends on who I'm with,
Mhm.
having that,
Yeah.
that signal says you can relax, you're held, you belong here, you're safe. And then when that volume is turned down, even in good relationships, may not feel quite as soothing or reassuring, at least not right away. So much,
Yeah.
much bigger than just being a cuddle hormone.
It is. Thank you for going through the different parts of the brain there, Dr. Varden. In particular, I think it was really helpful to hear the different structures where all these receptors are and how that will fine tune different points of experience within the relationship, right? Like, because there were some
Right.
people that made the statement of, things stick with me a really long time. And now that we know that this is really involved in memory and decision making, it makes sense that having different receptive capacity, which we'll be talking about with our genes, will influence that rumination afterwards and future decisions and future appetite towards social engagements.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
I mean, it's just good to remember that oxytocin, it doesn't automatically make you kind or
Yeah.
calm. Okay. It amplifies whatever social cues your brain is already picking up.
Yeah.
So if the context feels safe and supportive, oxytocin can deepen that connection and trust. And if the context feels threatening, unfair, excluding, oxytocin can actually intensify defensiveness,
Hmm.
in group bias or
Yeah.
vigilance. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a very good modern day call out, right? I think with the echo chambers that the internet enables, sometimes people feel and identify very strongly with a group, and oxytocin actually can play a role in that. It creates this sense of group bondedness where I am me and my people are best and other people aren't, and it creates a little bit of division. Interestingly, even though it is still a relational hormone, it's something that we've evolved with in terms of I know the people of my town, they are safe. I don't know the people of the other town, so I must be a little bit more defensive and take pride in my town.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And, honestly, keeping that in mind of that amplification effect, this is one of the reasons why simple oxytocin supplements or nasal sprays
Yeah.
have not turned out to be those magic fixes for
Yeah.
social anxiety or autism or relationship struggles in clinical trials that they've had.
Yeah.
So, it's definitely keeping that in mind and being aware of not just your genes, but the reality of the way that you view relationships, how do you respond, can really help you understand where you are and then where you want to go.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, I love that. I love that. So, audience, are you ready? We're going to dive into it now. So, as Dr. Varden mentioned, and I will say this again, if you have the new genes within the DNA360, you're going to be going into the mood and behavior report. And then from that report, you're going to navigate to social bonding. So, audience, as Dr. Varden and I are talking about OXTR, and in a little bit, we're going to talk about other genes that adjust that social dial. Um, we're not expecting you to do all the fancy math and all the genetic interpretation to figure out where you stand on this social spectrum, on this how hungry are you for social relationship? Do they impact you a lot? We've done that for you. The assessment is called social bonding. So while we are going through different genes that are part of that, if you pop into your report is going to talk about, you have a lot of social sensitivity or you're very socially resilient. So that work has been done for you, but we're going to get a little bit nerdy on some of the genes that go into that assessment. Okay. And so the gene that we're looking at tonight, again, is OXTR. And we're going to be looking at two different SNPs within that gene. Okay. And I'm a bit of a broken record, but I think it's an important record to play for you. When we talk about SNPs, I want you to think about a gene like a book. And when you're reading a book, there's a plot, there's a story, you know what's going on. And within that book, some pages are going to be a lot more important to that plot than other pages. There's going to be some pages that say, oh, this is the who done it. And it was, Mr. Brown in the living room with the candlestick, right? And then there's other going to be pages where it's waxing poetics. Maybe it's Mr. Brown giving Miss Violet a beautiful love poem where that's lovely, but not necessarily central to the plot. When we're talking about SNPs, we're talking about two pages within a gene, within a book, and science has found those two pages to be really, really, really important to the plot. So we're going to be talking again about two SNPs today that are part of the book or the gene that is OXTR. Okay. And again, reminder, you don't have to do this math yourself. It's already done for you in the DNA 360. So the first SNP or the first page that we're going to be looking at is RSID 53576. Okay. And you're going to see, you can see a range of two different alleles here. You can see some G's or you can see some A's, right? G represents the variant that is going to have a better or a stronger receptor for oxytocin compared to A, which is going to have some of the problems that we're going to discuss shortly. Okay, so the ideal form, people always ask that, what is the ideal form? You're looking for a GG here. Okay. Now, what does this SNP influence? This SNP is going to influence how strongly the oxytocin receptor is going to respond to oxytocin. So remember, as Dr. Varden mentioned, in the brain, when we do social things, there's going to be an outpouring of oxytocin. And that oxytocin is going to connect with the receptor. This gene really says once that connection has been made, how strong is that message? The stronger messages come from people with a G allele presentation here. People with AG or AA tend to have a little bit of a weaker response. So, as Dr. Varden was saying around dials, someone with a GG has that dial turned all the way up compared to someone with an AA. The dial's turned a little bit down. It's not as loud. You're not hearing it as much. So when we jump into the scientists, into the research, a lot of what the science says is that A alleles are often associated with lesser positive affect and social engagement. That really means if you're chatting with your bestie or you're chatting with a stranger, you're going to have lesser social presentations. That means open body language. That means engaged conversation, ability to read that person's face or the social cues. So you can kind of think about it. Have you ever walked into a room and you see two people talking and you can tell that one person's trying to get away and the person that they're talking to just isn't picking up on those signals? This is part of that ability to read into someone's face, that ability to understand some of those social cues, as well as to an extent offering them into the environment. Okay. People with the G alleles here, they are going to have better ability to read those social cues. They're also going to have slightly higher empathy. Again, that's because of all those points that oxytocin touches within the brain that Dr. Varden was talking about. And they're also going to be people that are going to be much more pro-social. They're the ones, if we're going back to that classroom, they might be the class clown or the popular kid, the one that's reaching out and wanting to engage in a lot of this social behavior. Okay. Another really neat thing that is pulled out in this gene, in these studies from this book, and I want people to be mindful of this, is this idea of social resilience. Okay. How many times have you made a social faux pas, right? Maybe that's you're supposed to give a big presentation at work, and maybe you're supposed to say, "Oh, the sky is blue," and then you say, "Oh, the sky is purple." It's an honest mistake, but the question is how well able are you to recover from that? And really interestingly, this gene, this SNP, speaks to that. What it says is those with A alleles, when they make a little bit of a social mistake, nothing serious, but something those are um maybe you say the wrong thing in front of someone, maybe you trip. Like, how can you recover when you do something like that in front of other people? And people with A alleles, they tend to struggle a little bit with that recovery. They tend to struggle a little bit with, oh, I have to collect and continue on with my presentation. They get a little bit more stuck in it. And as Dr. Varden was mentioning, again, part of this comes down to you're not getting that calming effect. When oxytocin connects to that receptor, you're not experiencing that sense of calm and that easement that the G allele would be offering. Yeah. Um, Dr. Varden, before I move on to our next SNP or the next important page in the book, is there anything that you want to offer there? I know you have really great explanations around this SNP as well.
Uh, I would say probably just to, give a one sentence summary.
Yeah.
Okay. So I would say for like GG carriers, often starts a bit closer to, I'm probably safe with people.
Mm,
Okay. Where A carriers often start closer to, I need more information before I fully relax.
yeah.
So you can probably, figure out where each of you might land, and definitely take a look at your new genetic report. By the way, if you have not upgraded your DNA 360 reports and you want to see, what some of these new genes, where you lie in this, we are running a 10% off discount on our DNA 360. You can use code OXTR at checkout. And for a limited time, we are having you, if you've already done your test and you're just updating. So, I mean, if you've never done it before and you just want the test, well, then you get that 10% off with OXTR at checkout. If you've already done it, but you want the new genes, we are running a limited time for $329, and then you can enjoy your new upgraded test. So wanted to throw that out there.
Yeah, thank you.
Yep.
One thing I do want to offer to the SNP before I move on to the next SNP that we examine, I think I forgot to offer this, is the idea of how environment plays into this. So, one of the
Mm.
really tricky things in studying genetics is that you're never going to get a person who has lived in a bubble and hasn't had the environment engaging with their genes. We know that every person comes with their own story, but something cool science, the bigger the numbers, the more we can study. And so, people I want, especially people who have an A allele for this SNP, for this gene, I want them to hear that just because you have that A allele does not mean you're destined to antisocial behaviors and you're always going to be sensitive and your guard is always going to be up and you're trying to surmount and you're never going to get there. I really want to emphasize that there's a lot of interaction with environment here, and people who come from really supportive environments, meaning there hasn't been a lot of adversity or trauma within the childhood, they tend to still have wonderful, fulfilling, meaningful, connected relationships. Right. It's just that, as Dr. Varden said, that barrier, that trust factor, they have to, you just have to jump a little bit higher for our A alleles. For those on the call who are thinking, well, but I had a little bit of adversity or trauma in my childhood, this is going to be more where this gene is really going to be expressing itself, in that there's going to be higher sensitivity to social rejection. There's going to be a little bit of, even in those good relationships, a little bit of a sense of insecurity. Okay. And so that can be shifted and changed, though, right? Especially working with a provider who now knows how your oxytocin is leveraged and that they have to cultivate that trust initially, but also on an ongoing basis. This can absolutely be supported. This is not a social death sentence. Instead, this is, now that we know more in relation to your history, in relation to you, and in relation to whatever goals, you can work with a provider in a better, stronger, more personalized and individualized way. I want to just make sure that it's known that this gene greatly interacts with the environment. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's not saying, oh, you're good with people or you're bad with people.
Hmm.
No, we're asking how quickly does your social support help this
Yeah.
nervous system you have settle? How
Yeah.
much structure and predictability might, you know, you or if you're a practitioner, and the person sitting in front of you, how much support might they need to feel
Yeah.
safe? Do we need
Yeah.
to teach more explicit skills around reading cues, naming needs, and even
Yeah.
repairing after conflict? So, this is only for digging into that curiosity that you all said
Yeah.
that you had in the poll questions, to just say, hey, what about this? How can I make this better?
Yeah. 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 So I think Anne mentioned, this is great for clients and doctors or patients and doctors. So close. We're going to get there. Or perhaps in your other relationships, a lot of this can say is, here is what I need to do to establish trust and continue trust. And when there's a moment where there's an argument here, I need, especially with this person, if there's a social faux pas, really need to reinforce the care there. It just shifts how you can engage with the people that you care about.
Right.
Yeah.
So
All
I think we
right.
move on to the next variant
We
of the OXTR.
are. Yeah. So the other page in the book of OXTR that we look at, this page, I'm only going to say this number once, but make sure you write down the last three digits. This page is 2254298. So just take the last three there. There's only two snips. The last three digits are different. The last three digits are 298. Okay. The beauty of things, we're talking about the same letters, and even more beautiful in this instance, G is your optimal allele, A is the suboptimal allele. So for both SNPs, you got a G, you got the stronger receptor. Both SNPs, if you have an A, unfortunately, a little bit of a weaker receptor. Okay. So, this next snip that we looked at, one of the reasons we drew this in, and this one's a bit of an interesting one, because there's a little bit of sex differentiation in the literature. So, audience, I want to make sure that at the DNA company, we do our best to stay on the bleeding edge of science. And so, right now, there is sex differentiation in this SNP, meaning females may have a different presentation than males given the same alleles. But this is still bleeding edge, and this could shift with time and more research. So make sure you continually check back with your test, because again, as the research develops, we may say, oh, actually, both sexes are the same, or we may say, oh, no, this is a very strong differentiator between females and males. Okay. So what exactly are these sex-specific patterns? So in females who carry an A allele, and remember the A allele is the allele that says your oxytocin receptor does not create loud signaling, strong volume when the two connect. Females with that A allele, they tend, or they're showing to present in studies, small studies, but still studies nonetheless, with greater attachment anxiety. They are going to have a bigger fear of rejection. There's going to be more worry about abandonment, and there's going to be more preoccupation with closeness. Okay. And so these are the people that are going to be grasping and reaching a little bit more in terms of once they've established that relationship, kind of asking that question, needing to hear, yes, I do love you. Yes, I do care for you on a consistent basis. Because with that oxytocin, it's not signaling loud enough for them to feel entirely secure. Okay. So they need a little bit more of that reinforcement, as well as getting relationships off, starting that relationship with someone. That trust barrier is going to be a lot higher, and there's going to be a little bit more of those insecure attachment patterns. This gene is not something I do not want you to say with women, we can now diagnose attachment styles. There is so much more that goes into it than just this, but this is an important one where sex does matter. So for females specifically, with that A allele, they tend to be a little bit more anxious and insecure in some of their relationships and needing a little bit more reinforcement from their partner or the social group that they are with. Now, the other side of the coin is going to be males. Males, interestingly, they'll show a little bit more autism spectrum traits. This is not to diagnose autism. I'm going to repeat that. This is not to diagnose autism. Autism is a very complex condition. Genetically speaking, there is not a singular gene. There is a gaggle, a gajillion genes that influence, and this is amongst them. But specific to males, if you have that A allele, there's going to be a little bit more of a struggle in terms of social communication and reading cues. There's going to be a little bit more of a inability to pick up on people's cues as well as ability to offer some of those social cues. So whereas the females are going to be a little bit more insecure and reaching out and grasping and fearful of abandonment, males with this presentation tend to be a little bit more inward drawn and struggle to both offer or receive some of those social cues. So that's the sex differentiator there. It's all beginning studies right now. These are trends that we're starting to see, and science is currently, creating the bigger studies to see if this is true. But I think this is really interesting and neat science that further gives us clarity into what our genes can tell us about our experience of the world and how we can engage with it. Okay. So, when we think about how do we translate this into the real world, if you are a female with an A allele here, right, you want to be thinking around both within yourself and in your relationship, attachment work, right? How do you best feel attached to someone, and can you communicate that so they can offer it to you? As well as, especially as you're getting into those relationships or going through moments of fear and worry, right? Remembering that while that's totally valid, you have definitely a lower threshold towards those feelings. And so working with that. For the males out there, if they have that A allele, this could be a trigger, especially if you see yourself in the I struggle a little bit with my social communication. Really learning, perhaps working on some behaviors as well as becoming more explicit with it, right? I don't necessarily pick up on these cues. So if you could offer me words instead of cues, the more you know about yourself, the more you can ask people to help you and to translate the world for you. Right, Dr. V? Oh, you're muted, Medell.
Yes, yeah, you are right.
Oh, okay.
I
Okay, I'm
say,
glad I
yes,
didn't go momentarily
absolutely.
deaf.
No, that was me. I had some noise in the background. I didn't want that to disrupt.
Yeah.
So, no, absolutely. And this is all the more that knowing yourself, you can better navigate in the world and help others to understand you. And what else? What else is there with a good relationship but that? Understand yourself to understand
Mhm.
others.
Yeah, I like that.
So now that we've covered the OXTRs, I think that the next step is bringing in those supporting gain dial genes, serotonin, dopamine, the opioid systems that layer on how intense social pain feels and how rewarding connection is for each person.
Yeah. So as Dr. Varden mentioned, as we will say time and time again, social behavior is never going to boil down to one gene because there's a lot of different things going on in the brain. There's a lot of different structures and there's a lot of different neurotransmitters. And so in our social bonding assessment, we don't just consider OXTR. We consider a lot of other genes that will influence your sense of calm, your sense of reward, your sense of motivation to be engaged with the world, your ability to think and make decisions. So, some of these things, for example, we are absolutely considering serotonin. In the DNA360, there's several genes that look at the creation, the recycling, the receptors of serotonin, and all of this plays into our assessment of how do you socially bond? Because those that have a poor serotonin picture, those that don't necessarily have access or strong reception of serotonin, they're lacking a sense of calm, kind of like what we're talking with oxytocin, right, Dr. V? So it's the poorer the serotonin, the greater the agitation and lack of calm is going to be, which kind of puts you off on a bad foot if you're trying to socially engage with others.
Right. I mean, if you think of OXTR as setting the
Mhm.
social safety set point, well, the 5-HTLPR, which is, included in serotonin, but the serotonin
Yeah.
system can actually be thought of as your mood baseline and how strongly your brain words, how
So
strongly
close.
your brain reacts to social threats like criticism, rejection,
Mhm.
conflict. So, yeah. And I mean, you can continue to speak into a little bit more how that can change the sensitivity.
Yeah, yeah. Essentially, for people who have a lower dial turn, meaning they don't have a lot of serotonin or they're not responding to it, they are going to be much more sticky, a little bit more agitated. And so they, again, are not going to have that field, that space where they're going to want to go and be social. And especially if things socially happen, you give that presentation and you accidentally say something you didn't mean to say, there's not going to be that internal sense of calm that can carry you through it. So serotonin plays a big role in that calm stage where you can form your relationships. And Dr. Varden, do you want to talk a little bit about dopamine and how dopamine will influence social behavior?
Absolutely. So dopamine, and there's a couple of genes that I'll mention, but there's several genes that actually are related to the dopamine pathway. So DRD2 and COMT, and these are dopamine related genes, and together they help tune how rewarding everyday connections feel, how much motivation you feel to seek out and maintain relationships. And some of these patterns are linked with things like blunting a reward from normal social interactions. Maybe a connection may feel more flat or less motivating, or even a tendency to either withdraw or seek more intense stimulation, especially under stress. So,
Mhm.
for you clinicians out there, this can look like I care about people, but I don't naturally feel energized by small talk or routine connection. It takes more to light up my reward system. Okay. So, these are areas that you can look. And actually, I just thought about this. This works into a lot of the uh, behavioral tests, Myers-Briggs. Where do you get your energy? Are you an extrovert, an introvert? That would be a great study to look at someone's gene patterns and then look at their behavioral testings, things like the Myers-Briggs, to
Oh.
see how that correlates.
Well, so I can't speak to Myers-Briggs, but I do know with um, OXTR in particular, the first SNP that we talked about. And let me pull up the numbers so that I don't have these numbers memorized. Give me a moment, audience. So the first OXTR SNP that we talked about, and the last three numbers there are 576. This is a very well studied SNP. And part of that is because there's a very well known social science experiment that happens. And what scientists will do, and often, let's be honest, to undergraduates, because they have to get their credits for their courses, they bring all these they bring these undergraduates in and they tell the undergraduate, dear undergraduate, you have to give a presentation and you have to give a presentation on, and they'll tell them to give a presentation on something that everyone knows. Maybe it's tell us how to drive a car or tell us how to walk a dog. Something like that, something that everyone knows, even if they haven't done it before. And what they'll do is they'll have people in the audience, and these people are plants. They are researchers. And these researchers are meant to be frowny faces. Essentially, when the person says, oh, to walk a dog first, you have to put on a leash, they're going to look at the person and go, oh, yeah. The goal of these people in the audience is to make them feel uncomfortable, to really create that scenario of social discomfort. And this is a well-replicated study. When you put someone who's supposed to socially perform and you give them negative social feedback, they tend to, their heart rate will go up, their neurochemistry changes, they'll stumble words. And when we compare, when genes were considered in this experiment, people with A alleles, especially for that first SNP, so the SNP ending in 576, they tended to have higher heart rate spikes, higher cortisol spikes, higher ability or higher inability to recover after the fact. They were a lot more sensitive to that audience feedback compared to people with G alleles. So it's neat that while it's not Myers-Briggs, it's very cool that in the real world, these genes truly do play out in different scenarios.
Yeah, it's really amazing. It's like I said, it just
Yeah.
tickles my scientist
Yeah.
genes. There you
Yeah.
go.
Yeah. All right.
So there's another system, another network that also plays a factor, and that's the
Yeah.
opioid
Yeah.
uh, network. So would you like to speak into that?
Yeah. So, audience, this is going to be a little bit of a tease because we're not going to talk about the opioid receptor tonight. It is a new gene that we have within our reports, and soon we will be giving a presentation on it, our webinar here, and talking about it. But short of detailing the specific gene, which again is part of your DNA 360, opioids are something that your body will naturally produce. And so we're not talking about a drug that you might take. But we are talking about when you go through or when you need a little bit of pain relief, opioids are created. And sometimes that's going to be a very physical pain, right? That's why we get opioid medication post surgery. It's to mask some of that physical pain. But interestingly, opioids are also produced in response to social pain, to emotional pain. And so your ability to respond to opioids is going to influence your social ability because, again, we're all going to make mistakes. We're all going to get up on stage and say something foolish. And so the idea is if you have better reception of these opioids, you're going to have better pain relief and better ability to recover. Okay. So again, this is a small part. The social bonding algorithm does all this mathing for you, but we want to inform you of the different things that go into this. We're not so focused on just one factor because socialization we know has a gajillion different factors. And the social bonding assessment does most of that for you. And then we dive into some of the specifics in these webinars. Yeah. All right, Dr. Varden, is there anything to be said before we move on to questions and answers?
Hmm. Well, we really a matter of pulling a lot of what we just talked about together. So when we're talking about social DNAU and DNA360 frameworks, so Dr. Kosterman spoke about the OXTR variants,
Mhm.
the ones ending in 576 and the one ending in 298. And
Mhm.
they set how easily the social safety system turns on.
Mhm.
Then we talked about the serotonin network, and this adjusts the emotional gain on social stress and support. Then we talked about the dopamine network, and that really influences how rewarding connection feels. And then a little teaser about the opioid network, and this really helps determine how much social pain hurts. So,
Mhm.
different combinations of these dials help explain why some people feel deeply nourished by connection and bounce back quickly from conflict. And others
Mhm.
feel both connection and rejection very strongly and may need more structure,
Mhm.
skills, and support to feel safe in relationships. So, this really, I think, reflects so beautifully the answers in our poll questions when we
Mhm.
were asking you, what do you tend to feel when? And we got that beautiful, uh, separation of where everyone felt. And I hope that each of you are starting to recognize and realize where you fit and starting to understand how you work in social situations. So we hope that that part of our webinar has been very insightful and fun. And are we ready to get to question and answers?
I think so. Thank you for that beautiful summary. That was helpful. I loved it. Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right. Okay, I think Noah has our first question. So Noah is asking, what is the best oxytocin peptide dosage for a male and for a female per day intravenously to improve overall mood, love, and happiness according to our genetic map? Oh, Noah, I think Dr. Varden, to an extent, preemptively answered this question in terms of, the success or lack thereof when it comes to oxytocin supplementation. So close. Dr. Varden, do you want to share that with Noah?
Yeah. Well, the thing is that when we're talking about oxytocin, first of all, it's a prescription hormone. It's generally given to women during labor and delivery in the form of pitocin, okay, or certain acute medical situations. It's not a daily mood or love treatment because there's so many things that it does. And remember, I had mentioned earlier on that it's an amplifier. It will amplify what is currently going on for you in your environment, your social situations, in your relationships. So, if it's not handled very well, you don't necessarily want that amplified. This isn't something of a peptide to do just one thing. And, really, I would highly encourage you to look back and to listen to the replay on this as we talked about all the different areas and the nuances, the different areas of the brain that oxytocin connects to in its receptors, and how that plays and interacts with all of these other systems. So, uh, yeah, I mean, really, what your genetic map can tell us is how sensitive your social brain is to connection or conflict. Um, and you want to work at that, to have better overall mood, relationships, use those tools and techniques.
Yeah,
So that's where I would go with that.
I love that. Thank you. All right. The next question, I'm actually going to combine. So, Nina and Noah asked questions of a similar nature.
Mm-hmm.
And what they were asking, in essence, was, does oxytocin do anything other than support social bonding? And the answer is yes. This is always context specific research. So, for people who study the immune system and immune defenses, oxytocin has been seen to calm down a lot of our inflammatory response, some of the cytokine storms. This is relevant in terms of COVID. So, it seemed to attenuate, modulate, bring some of that down. So, oxytocin is seen to play into the immune system. If you're someone that studies cardiometabolics, cardio meaning heart and ticker, metabolics meaning how do you manage your calories, your food, your body composition, we're also seeing that the people with better access to it, as well as more triggerings of it, i.e., greater relationships, greater social bonds, they notice cardioprotective effects. And part of that absolutely comes from the fact that it's an immune regulator. Part of that comes from the fact that it's a cortisol regulator. There's many different avenues that this touches on. And what it makes me think of, interestingly, is we I forget the fellow's name, and Dr. Varden, you would absolutely know this fellow's name. But when we talk about human needs, right, we always hear about you need air, you need rest and sleep, you need food. And within the 1900s and 2000s, one other thing that we're starting to recognize and really honor is you also need social connection. And people with better social connections typically have better health. And again, part of that is absolutely if you're socially connected and you're sick, someone can come and scoop and help you out. But another part, and this is where oxytocin comes in, social environment or social relationships, social engagements, which flood your body with oxytocin to bond, also then have cardiometabolic and immune and cortisol and stress and all those happy thing responses. So it's to say social bonds help you in your experience of the world, but then also beautifully help your body. So, Nina, so Noah, yes, oxytocin does play a huge role in the immune system. It also plays a role in cardiometabolics, the HPA axis, and I would imagine because of all those, many indirectly at least, all the systems within our body.
Yeah, well, oxytocin signaling also has been linked to things like skeletal muscle regeneration and maintenance,
Oh,
especially with aging or after injury. And with
yeah.
cardiometabolic repair, it helps to reduce inflammation and cell death and supports blood vessel growth in the
Mhm.
spine area. Helps with bone and cartilage health, skin
Yeah.
wound healing. I mean, it's just amazing what it can do. So,
Mm.
it does. I think it would be more appropriate to say that it participates in whole body repair processes, especially where inflammation and, as you said, stress hormones, where all of these things are involved. All right.
Yeah.
Okay, so I know the next question actually had mentioned you. So is
Mm.
asking, what is the letters of the bonding section, Dr. Krista? You said them super fast. I'm doing notes when
I
my
tend to
results come
speak fast. Yeah.
in.
So, Lisa, the genes that we've talked about tonight, or at least we've talked about two SNPs, two pages in the gene or the book, that is OXTR, and beautifully both have the same allele presentations. So you're going to see either G's or A's, G being the more beneficial, in that you have a stronger reception. A's being suboptimal, meaning that you're not going to have as strong a reception of oxytocin. Okay. So G's and A's wonderfully for both, G being optimal, A being suboptimal. Yeah. All right, Dr. Varden, I think the next question is for you. Um, so Deborah is asking, so Dr. Varden's explanation of social safety signaling of oxytocin, and they can't help thinking of how that can interplay with autism and the social challenges that come with that. Does this new gene information feed into your work families coping with autism and the guidance you give?
And, for this, and I know that Dr. Kosterman, you had mentioned about
Mm,
autism, that, genetics can enrich the formulation and the guidance about environment and
mhm,
communication. But actual autism diagnosis and treatment planning still depend on comprehensive in person evaluation with
mhm,
qualified clinicians. But yes, of course, the genetics, our reports can help with that underlying understanding, giving some foundational support, with your group, with the doctors that may be working with that. So
yeah,
I find that, knowing your DNA, knowing your pathways, knowing these networks and assessments is just helpful, that knowledge to help better understand you and letting you turn smaller dials to make
yeah,
bigger changes.
yeah. I like that. Okay. Brenda has our next question. Brenda is saying that so for their OXTR, and I'm not sure which SNP, they're saying that they're a heterozygous. What does that mean? Audience, I'm going to explain this one. So Brenda is saying that they are an AG instead of being an AA or a GG. So, all right, like get your spectacles on. Here we go. When we talk about genes, typically the two extreme opposites, in the case of OXTR, GG is one end, AA is the other end, meaning that GG is going to have that strong pro social, high empathy, low threat barrier compared to AA, where AA is going to have lesser empathy, greater sense of threat and fear, and less pro social behavior. Those are the two extremes. When we're talking about our heterozygous, that's the AG, typically heterozyguses fall a little bit in the middle, meaning they're not one extreme, they're other, they fall in the middle. With OXTR, for both SNPs, the middle is actually shifted or tilted a little bit towards the suboptimal side. That A allele is really strong in terms of it does most of the coloring of the behavior. So someone with an AG is not going to be a full AA. They're not going to have those extreme, you know, less pro-social, less empathy, but they will sit a little bit closer to that. It's not a true 50-50 split. Okay.
All right. So the next question is from Lar, and they're asking, do we have percentages of the presence of these SNPs and effects? And if you'll allow me, I'm going to answer this at a high level because the exact percentages can vary from study and ancestry group. So for the OXTR variants that we've discussed, both the G and the A versions are common in the general population. It's not like this is a rare mutation, okay? Many large samples often show each genotype group. So we're talking GG, AG, AA, and we're talking in the ballpark of tens of percents, not tiny fractions. So we're talking about common temperament differences, not rare disorders. So in terms of effect sizes, excuse me, most of these social and mood-related SNPs explain only a small percent of the overall variations in traits. And typically we're talking a few percent or less for any single variant. And that's why we emphasize the pattern across multiple genes plus life experience rather than hanging too much on just one SNP. I mean, they're helpful as nudges and clues, not as standalone predictors.
Mm-hmm. Love it. Okay. Michelle has the next question, and they're asking where they can find their specific SNP presentations for OXTR. So, Michelle, there's going to be two places. As mentioned, if you don't want to do any of the math work, go into social bonding, and that is going to consider everything that we've talked about from oxytocin and serotonin and dopamine and opioids, all the fun things. That is all considered in the assessment there. If you're looking for specific gene specific SNPs, if when you go to mood and behavior, and you scroll down on the page a little bit, it's going to list all of the genes. And they are alphabetized, so all you have to do is scroll down that list until you get to the O's, and you will see both of the SNPs presented there, including a statement of if you're a GG, this is what that means. If you're an AA, this is what that means. Okay.
All right. So Brenda has a question. She's saying, would you share which genes are opioid genes and which are for serotonin?
There's a lot. So part of our work at the company is creating assessments that consider a whole host of genes. So I won't be going into the specifics, but if you do go into the mood and behavior, again, scrolling down through all the genes that we offer there, you'll find a lot that are associated to serotonin, to opioids, to dopamine, etc. Yeah. But there's an element of secret sauce when it comes to our assessments.
All right. So Robin is asking, wouldn't environmental experiences, for example, adverse childhood experiences, have as much or more influence on reactions and behaviors in social experiences?
Mm-hmm.
So I would say yes, environmental experiences, especially things like the ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, often have, as much or more influence on social reactions and behavior rather than any single genetic variant. And the reason I say that and the way that I think about this is that the genes set some of the sensitivity and thresholds, how loud the social safety or threat signal can get. When you're talking about experiences, especially early ones, these shape the wiring patterns, learned expectations, and coping strategies that sit on top of that biology. And, in many of the studies we're drawing from, the strongest effects show up when sensitive genotypes and high adversity are combined. For example, Dr. Kosterman was talking about the OXTR or the serotonin genes, these patterns plus high ACE scores that tells us we should pay at least as much attention to the healing environments, trauma-informed support, and relationship quality as we do to the genetic map.
Yeah.
So wonderful question. Thank you.
Yeah. If I can add in a little bit, um,
Please.
in particular for the OXTR SNP that ends in 298, um, that one's been a little bit more studied in terms of if you're suboptimal, meaning you have that A allele. Researchers did go in and ask some questions around, did you have a history of and those adverse and the trauma and whatnot. And they found that people with the A's and the trauma tended to have much more of a magnified presentation compared to the A's that did not have that. So there's always still that little bit of, an ability to pick up on some social cues, but it's much more magnified, unfortunately, especially since this governs fear and threat reception in those, unfortunately, with that. So everything that Dr. Varden just said, science has kind of gone in and underscored. Yeah.
All right. So our next question is from Heidi. And she said, if I have a GG genotype for the 298 gene and an AG with the 576, is this not a contradiction?
Yeah. No, no. So, as mentioned, Heidi, think about OXTR like a book. A lot of pages in a book. Not all pages are created equal. And so we're looking at two really important pages in the book. So we're looking at two different points in terms of is your story for reception of oxytocin? Is it a strong story? You really receive that well, you get a lot of those pro things, or is it a story of struggle that you're not as strong, you don't get that signaling? And so different pages are going to give us different pieces of information. And so it's very possible out there that some person on one page is going to have great oxytocin receptor ability, and another person may not have a page. Each one of these SNPs typically informs how the protein is folded. And so it's just going to shift a little bit of the configuration. So you're able to have a contradiction between the two. And a lot of what our assessment and social bonding does is reconciling, especially some of that contradictory information. Yeah.
So Ellen is asking our next question. She said, can you speak to the difference between the serotonin related genes and what does CT allele mean?
Mm-hmm.
So
Is
I
that for
think you
me?
can help clarify. Well, I mean,
Yeah, no, I
I
can
think
take
that
it.
I'd throw that at you. Yeah, please.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So, Ellen, in terms of serotonin, we have a lot of genes that speak to serotonin. So we have a few genes that look at how effective of a recycler. So close, Ellen. It's been a long day. So we have some genes that look at how much do you make. We have some genes that look at how effective are you at recycling because the body loves to recycle. We have some genes that look at receptors. So all of those genes will lend to the end of how do you manage your serotonin. And because we have so many different genes that look at serotonin, you saying, what does the CT allele mean? I'd need to know which specific gene you're talking about because they all speak to um, different parts of the serotonin process within your body. Okay. But for those that are still here and listening, from the terms of new genes, a lot of our new genes have to do with serotonin receptors, a little bit with creation as well. So we've really enriched the storytelling and the perspective we have on serotonin through our new genes.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you. So our last question is from Laura. And she asks, if you have AG in both your OXTR alleles, what would that mean? You spoke about
Mhm.
GG and AA, but what about the
Mhm.
AG scenario and what can we do about it?
Yeah. So as mentioned, that's going to be your heterozygous presentation. And for both SNPs, typically heterozygous, we always think it lands 50% in the middle. You get 50% of the good, 50% of the bad. For both of the OXTR SNPs, if you have that AG, that dial shifts a little bit more towards that A side. So it's not saying 100% you're just an AA. This is not exact math, but you're probably sitting more like, you're 60 to 70% like AA and only, 30 to 40% like GG. So think about it just as a little bit of a tilted dial, unfortunately, towards the suboptimal side of things.
Yeah. And I do
Mhm.
want to mention about focus. What do you do about it?
Yeah.
And the focus should still be the same core work we've been talking about for everyone.
Mhm.
Notice your patterns in connection and conflict.
Yeah.
Build predictable, clear communication in your key relationships, and use skills and supportive environments to help your nervous system feel safer over time. Ideally, with guidance from your own clinicians or therapists when obviously when needed. So realize that having a heterozygous AG doesn't mean good or bad. It just means you have one copy of each version, and the real leverage is still in awareness, relationships, healing work, not in trying to change the letters themselves.
Yeah. 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 I like it. I love that. I love that because I think once you know yourself better, perhaps maybe your child, your partner better, it shifts how you can approach that relationship. If you know that their guard is up and that they don't necessarily pick up on certain facial cues, you're able to compensate for that and create, be more obvious in creating that trusting environment, or perhaps be a bit more explicit when you're trying to communicate with someone, not rely just on face and other cues that some people may not be able to pick up on. So I love, Dr. Varden, that you're talking about. It's not a matter of changing, it's just being like, cool, this is what I am, and here's how I will adapt to that.
That's right.
Yeah.
So I will say we have come to the end of our question and answers, and
Hmm.
I'm very grateful for everyone being here with us and learning about yourselves, about your social life environments, and what you can do about it. So
Hmm.
I appreciate you, Dr. Kosterman. This is always fun to be able to do a
Likewise.
webinar with you.
Likewise. I'm very grateful for you, Dr. Varden, as well. And I'm grateful for the audience that shows up here and motivates us and creates a space of trust and sociability. So I hope, audience, that both Dr. Varden and I have added to your understanding of yourself, to your understanding of the DNA 360, and to the doctors and the parents and the lovers out there. I hope this has also really added to your understanding of those about you and how you might be able to better further those relationships.
And keep being curious.
Hmm. All right, Medell, I think we've gotten to that time of day. You ready for
Yeah.
the big fish story? All
Yes.
right, audience, to the end of being social, because we now know that being social influences your immune system, your cardiovascular
Mhm.
system, your stress system, and your relational system. There is a study, it is my big fish study, because every time I talk about it, the fish gets even bigger. Science, oh, it does. One day this is going to cure cancer. It's going to be great. So science asks the question, we know exercise is really, really good for your mental health. Science asks the question, what is the best form of exercise? And the answer was dancing, because not only does it bring an elevation of mood, it also helps your cognitive abilities. So audience, to the end of helping everyone's cognitive abilities and their mood, we dance out. And I know that some people in the audience dance out with us because people have started to email me and let me know that they dance with us. So praises to you for letting me know that I am not making a fool of myself alone, and I am not forcing Dr. Varden to make a fool of herself alone. So if Vanny, Maya, and Brittany would like to join us, turn on the music. We are going to be dancing out. Thank you so very much.